This is Chris Goldthorpe with ChrisChess.com, and this is another game where Black, who is rather new at playing the Najdorf, played the Najdorf. And when you play the Sicilian, especially when you're just starting, you have to hope that you're going to get the variation you want, whether you play the Dragon, Scheveningen, Classical, any of the different variations of the Sicilian that Black can play. Usually any one of them requires White's cooperation. For example, White has these alternate ways to play the Sicilian as White that you might not be so familiar with. So among them are moves like c3, the wing gambit, which is rather rare, moves like f4 immediately, knight to e2 followed by knight c6. There's quite a few ways that White can play without playing an open Sicilian, where he fianchettos the bishop sometimes. So Black has to be somewhat familiar with those. Also the variations where White quickly trades off his king's bishop so that he can castle quickly. So as long as Black is aware of that, it might help him. So this move is often misunderstood. The purpose of this move is not to guard this pawn, because this pawn's going to trade for a pawn anyway. And it's also not to get the bishop out or to allow the knight to go to d7 or the queen to go to d7, much less the king to go to d7. This pawn has the duty of being able to capture this e-pawn if it comes forward, because Black expects to have an open c-file. So Black expects normally to make their pressure on the queen side. So Black is going to castle king side, and so he's going to bring this knight to f6 and doesn't want it to be knocked away, because the king's position is best defended by a knight in that position. So that's what this move is about. White plays d4, which is very common among very strong players. Now, I had mentioned this. There's two similar variations. There's the Rosalimo variation, where Black had played his knight here first instead of d6, and then this move happens. There's the Moscow variation, but the idea of this for White is just to quickly castle, and then typically he's going to play d4 after that. So we'll see continuations like this. Now Black can take with his knight here. You see, it's not a forbidden move. White could castle, and then he could play this way. As Black, I might prefer taking with a knight, even though the computer thinks queen takes is better, or the databases do, but they're both playable moves. But you can encounter this sometimes, so it's good to be aware of it, maybe look at some games where that move is played. So this game follows a very standard path, and we get to here, which is a pretty standard position in the Sicilian. And now Black could play the Dragon, the Scheveningen, or the Najdorf, classical variation. But Black has been true to his variation here, and he got to play his Najdorf. Now, this is one of White's most popular moves, bishop e3. There used to be this strange line where they would go here, and then he went here, and then he went back here, and they went back and forth and had a draw one time. But I saw a game where after this move, White attacked the bishop, and it went back, and then he went here, and he did this, and then Black did this. And I got to tell you honestly, if I had seen this game from one of my students, I would have been telling him, why are you moving these pawns on the edge of the board? Yet it was no less than Garry Kasparov playing the black pieces here. And then the game continued like this. And sometimes this bishop goes back to f2. So there are some extremely bizarre and tactical variations in every line of the Sicilian. It's one of those openings that you really need to be up on, unlike openings like the Four Knights game, where there hasn't been any significant theoretical changes for 150 years. So that's one of the strange variations that can occur off of bishop e3. And also, if the knight comes back here, it's white's move, but what we've got is it's as if white played the bishop g5 variation and now gets to make an additional move. So it would make me wonder about this. Maybe you'll have an observation about that to answer that question. It's like, why would black make this move? So it would certainly explain why h6 is better than bringing the knight back again. Okay, so what are some other moves that white can play that black needs to be aware of? Well, bishop g5 is one of the main ones. John Nunn wrote a 320-page book where the whole thing goes forward from this position alone. This is certainly one of the more popular variations for white. This is a pretty standard response by black. And then after f4, which I recommend, there are several good book alternatives for black. One of the most popular is the poison pawn variation, which happens in this game, so I'll talk about it last. This is a fully viable way to play here, to just move the bishop to e7, breaking the pin. And then typically the queen's knight will go to d7, this pawn will go to b5, the queen will go to c7. We'll see a typical line. And then we'll often see this little operation here where they trade and then push the pawn. And this knight has to go back here. He usually reappears at one of these two squares. It looks very scary to black to castle on the king side, but normally if he castles, will still castle there. Now, you might wonder, why doesn't he go to e5? See if you see any moves that you really like for white here. Because he's got to save his queen first. And actually, queen h3 looked good to me as well, putting tremendous pressure on e6. That's the normal move there. Surprising that there is a normal move there. And of course, white always likes to eventually get that move in. e6, as I said in the other video, is a place that white attacks when black plays the Najdorf. Also often when he plays the French defense. So at this point, white would be completely winning. So somewhere along the way there, some alleged book move, and you'll find that a lot when you do research on the Najdorf. You'll find book lines that the engine thinks that one side is completely winning. And then you can let the engine sit there for a few minutes on that position, and after a few minutes it may completely reverse itself. But as you can see, in all of these, white attacks on the king side and black on the queen side. This is not an easy variation for either side if they're new at it, because there's a lot of stuff going on. A lot of indirect fighting, in that each one is pursuing their own goals without directly countering the goals of their opponent. Often by the time either side is in trouble, it's too late. Yeah, knight e5 didn't work out so well, as we just saw after queen g3. So that's why normally that would be the move. So back to our game, bishop e3, and we looked at bishop g5 as an alternative. Let's see what some other alternatives are. Bishop e2. I would refer you to a game in Bobby Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games, where Fischer was white against a player named Platnik. And that game also continued with this move. The knight's got to go back there. Going to f5 is a mistake. See if you can see what's wrong with moving to f5. Pause the video. Yeah, the idea of trying to win a pawn by knight takes e4 doesn't actually work out so well, because since white is going to lose this piece anyway, he can go here with check and then take the knight back, and that's why that doesn't work so well. So the right thing for black to do is what he can do now, is to just go ahead and play d5. And you can see that if the knight takes, then he'll play knight takes knight, and if queen takes queen, he'll trade queens, and at the end he'll win a whole piece, this knight, or a piece for a pawn if the knight takes a pawn with check. So let's go back to the bishop e2 line to look at the normal moves then. Bishop to b3 is what he normally does. Bishop e7 happened in the game. In this line with the knight here, this is a move that you want to stop, the bishop being here. And you don't always play b5 right away to do so. It depends on whether or not this bishop is going to find a nice life at b7. Sometimes white will play f3. So let's go opening book. And it actually has bishop e7 as a main move here. Bishop e6 stops bishop c4 right away. So apparently either one is fine here. Probably will just transpose. And we see the regular line. And you can see where the pieces tend to go in that variation. Let's look at the bishop c4 line. Bobby Fischer, who made the Najdorf very popular, turned around and made it very unpopular by playing this move against it, and then made it popular again with the way he played against his own system here. Bishop goes back, and then b5, and black is threatening to move the pawn up and take this pawn at e4. Castles, and of course the other bishop's going to come out. Black might wait to see whether he plays knight to d7 or bishop to b7. Notice the rook is unguarded. Sometimes white has this as a threat. So queen c7 leaves black able to play bishop to b7, hitting the queen if he were to move the pawn forward. White does have a lot of pressure on d5 because sometimes this move can be answered by merely moving the knight to d5, but here black does not have that option. So let's look at some of the other moves that white can play here. There's one that I don't show here, which is f4. Yeah, there it is, f4. Of course, the idea of that is in the event of e5 and black trying to put both of his bishops on the e file as he did before to play d5, we have f5. So he normally will go here right now, and then we might have a pawn trade because he's attacking the knight at the same time. White goes back, avoiding that, and this blocks off the d file. So if pawn takes, there's no queen trade. And that is actually not only dissuading black from playing this move, but also threatening to get this pawn down here and eventually even get a minor piece on b6 or fight for control of these black squares here. And this pawn can hold both of these back sometimes or make it difficult for the knight to develop. And he castles. And he castles. Now, once white castles, there are many times combinations that black has where he either puts a queen or a bishop on this diagonal and checks, or he pins something on d4, which I don't think we're going to see that this time. But that's why you will very often see white play king to h1 shortly after he castles in this opening. Okay, white's not going to get a chance to play f5 here. And he goes ahead and does that before he takes with the bishop. Otherwise, queen b6 check will get this pawn. Knight c5 to go after the bishop, which actually happens more often when the bishop is here at b3 after being c4 and then coming back. Other bishop takes, and if black trades his knight for the bishop, white has at very least the consolation of being able to either make this one not an isolated pawn, but I think he would prefer instead to take with his queen and have strong pressure on this isolated backward pawn of black's. Pins the knight, threatens to just give up his bishop for the knight. I don't think this is the best move for black. Let's see what would be good. It is a main line as far as theory is concerned. So, I'm somewhat surprised. It does develop a piece and pin the knight. It just seems a little early for black to trade his bishop off, but I guess that's something to be learned from this. And he backs up, gets ready to go to to g6. Yep, that's what he had in mind. So black now has 3 of his pieces attacking this pawn. White has 3 of his guarding it. So it is a target, but it is not an immobile target because it can move. He opens his F file completely, and black finally takes the C file. And that move seems rather odd because it's weakening his C file. That's exactly what I would expect white to do. Now I wouldn't be surprised for him to capture with his pawn. Yeah, he captures with the pawn. That way he doesn't have a weakness at e4 of an isolated pawn. And white will probably challenge the C file now in a symmetrical sort of way. Black finally gets d5 in. The knight takes it. What does white have for the sacrifice? Because he can't take the pawn. You see why? Because only the queen is guarding the bishop from this rook, so he can't take this. So now he's threatening to take it. But once again, white's ready to tear up black's king side. If he takes it, he'll trade these bishops, and his queen might go to h6 after this pawn comes to f6. So he just goes ahead and initiates the trade himself to win this pawn. White's d-pawn is now isolated, and I doubt that that is the most urgent thing for white to do. He attacks the knight a second time. White defends it a second time in a very active way. Of course, white can't take this d-pawn now. He's got 3 things attacking f7, so he's threatening to go knight f7. But that's not really a threat. How come? Well, first of all, he can just go ahead and take white's rook, and that pins the other rook. But he could just take with his bishop the simple way to recapture the knight. Rook takes is answered by rook takes, and the bishop is still double guarded by the king and queen against this remaining queen and rook. So rook e6, that's what that would look like. Okay, so black actually plays e5 here after this bishop e3 move, which is what he should do. So we're back to the game after looking at a few of the alternative variations that white can play, ones that people should know if they play the Najdorf as black. And bishop e7, and we're getting toward a middle game. Now when white castles kingside in this opening, he's almost guaranteed to play f4 soon, and should. And the way black deals with this sometimes is he puts his queen on c7, and in the event of f5, he moves his bishop here to c4 and trades off one of white's bishops, which presumably makes it more difficult for white to attack on the king side. Okay, now that gives this bishop nowhere to go. So what should white do? Pause the video. What should white do here? Of course. And this is pretty much where this game ends, I would think. It looks like he's trapped the whole bishop, but for some reason, this is only slightly better for white. Oh, because he's got the knight to capture. Otherwise, the bishop would have been completely trapped. Okay, so he has to take the knight, but this leaves white with a very nice center. And black's dream of getting d5 in, I don't see how he's going to do that now. Why is black so anxious to play d5? Because he wants to have the only pawn in the center, and he wants to have diagonals and files for his rooks and bishops, although one of his bishops is now gone. This move doesn't stop much, and it doesn't help much. Although that move is a normal move, normally, here the white square bishop is gone, so there's no benefit to being able to play bishop to b7 because the white square bishop is gone. Also, the A pawn is unguarded with a big rook defending it. That might not seem like a big deal. I mean, this rook is guarded, so he can't play knight takes pawn. But that it didn't really get black much. It stops him from playing bishop to c4, which pins this pawn. But white's interests should now probably be with bishop to f3 and knight to d5 and consolidating the center, and then eventually moving this over here, maybe putting the king corner, maybe even ending up with rooks on the G and F file. But with these bishops, I think white should try to make an all-out assault on white as fast as possible. B4. If white had played bishop to f3, the e-pawn would be secure anyway. So possibly white did this just to keep this knight off of c5. And I don't see any reason for black to keep fooling around over here. He needs to get his pieces involved. He's got a rook, a bishop, and a queen, and this knight that are all just kind of hanging out here sleeping. I think white is right to take it. So he finally gets to attack the pawn. And now, what would be wrong with taking this pawn for black? See if you can find the answer. It's not real hard. If black plays rook takes pawn, what is white's move? And look first, you guessed it, for checks and captures, especially moves that do both. Of course, if he takes with the queen, white will just take his queen, but if he takes with his rook, then knight takes bishop check. They show rook takes rook, and then knight takes bishop check. I suppose that's even better because you get a rook trade thrown in. But this is the idea that the queen would be overworked and cannot get from e7 to a5 directly in one move. So rook takes a5 might have been a tempting error there, though we shouldn't play for errors. If you know that a move is not good, you can't expect your opponent to do that. But I generally have to criticize a move like this because white's not really fully developing, and then he's just moving this knight forward here and leaving this unguarded. If he could see something specific, I don't see going after this bishop as a great thing for white, because this bishop has no moves at all and no real prospects of good moves for a long time. This knight can't go anywhere unless he goes to e4, and e4 used to be guarded by the knight. Now, yeah, I moved the pawn up to guard it, but he can take this back with the knight. But yeah, so with the knight under threat, it makes it. That's the only justification for him making this move, that this pawn came up to b4 to threaten him. It's not quite like the other game where white did that without provocation. So he takes a pawn. That is a big mistake. That's a big tactics mistake. Now, we have to always keep checks and captures in mind. I'm right in the middle of making a video for him right this moment. Okay, so let's see, where do we go from here? Okay, that's the move. That's the move. I hope you see what that wins. Because if black moves this knight to guard this one, then knight takes knight is check. And if the knight takes back, then the bishop can take the rook. So what is black to do? If he does what he did in the game, then the player of this game might remember what white did, but this is a fairly straightforward and fairly simple operation, because this is a capture and a check. The queen isn't guarding the rook anymore, but the rook is, but it doesn't matter so much because the rook is worth more than this bishop, even now. And so now things changed. Now white is winning and really should have won this game. So that was a bad situation here. You can see by this evaluation profile that white is getting better and better off as we approach move 20 early on. And I can't say that it's just because of knowledge of the opening, because I don't think either player was familiar with this somewhat unusual circumstance here. Even if we go back to before the F3 move, even before this D5 moves, yeah, there's no opening knowledge on this at all. So this move pretty much wins the game here. So this is what happens. He takes the rook, he takes back, queen here, knight guards it, he attacks the pawn again, he tries to guard it again. Now he starts moving the pawn down. The queen wants to also guard the back row. What? Okay. Pause the video for at least 5, 6, or 7 milliseconds while you find white's move in the, or first find a good move for black here. Okay, now if black does this, why in the world would, you know, he's going to get his king out of check, of course, but he can't do it that way. He can't do it that way because this is going to be check again, and he can win the queen back. So for either side, they had to do a bit of calculating here. Let's say the knight takes, but when on pawn takes rook equals queen, it's check. He could take back with his knight, and then he can move his king, and that's it. So white gets a rook for a bishop and a pawn this way. Takes. See, now he's threatening soon to do this check. Even that's not going to really win the queen, because the queen can go to F2 and get away from the knight at the same time. So yeah, this is just absolutely winning for white now. He takes with check, and so the knight takes back, and then he pins the knight. Now the knight could go to somewhere like c4 and guard the queen, but then it's going to be 2 rooks against 2 knights. It's actually amazing if black were able to draw from here, but it doesn't look likely. Is he allowing a fork there? He did. But there's a little trick. I think you will find it. Oh, no, there's a good move here for white. He can just pin the knight with one of the rooks. Then the other rook, then white can go queen takes queen check. So the pinning idea doesn't work. This was the idea to go here. However, black can just trade queens, take with check, and then take the rook. If only the rook could take back, but it cannot. So this is a good fork here. Once again, white missed the tactic. All right, so they trade, and then the rook takes this, threatening a back rank mate, so black has no time to grab the rook. So he moves his king, and now this rook could even go here, but he has a way to pin the knight and win it. And yeah, this is resigning time now. Check, and then takes here, and yeah, this is absolutely deadly for black. No reason to look at the rest.